Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming this morning. My name is Mohamed Hanafi. I'm the Managing Director of LYNX Strategic Business Advisors. We're an Egypt-based public policy and investment advisory firm. This event today on the implications of CBAM here in Egypt is part of a series of discussions that we have under the umbrella of our LYNX Forum platform, which is a platform for interactive, constructive engagement involving government, private sector, development partners, and other stakeholders on evolving policy and regulatory issues, opportunities and challenges that are of interest to the Egyptian private sector. We're very delighted to be to have among us today a distinguished speaker and special guests. First of all, we're delighted to have with us Dr. Mahmoud Mohieldin. He is well known to everyone. I'll leave my colleague Moataz to do the relevant introductions. But as you know, he is the UN high-level climate champion for the Egyptian COP27 presidency. We're also delighted to have with us this morning our dear colleagues from the Egyptian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ambassador Omar Abou Eish, the Secretary General of the Permanent Secretariat for the Egyptian EU Association Agreement, Ambassador Mohamed Nasr, the Director of the Department of Environmental Affairs at the Egyptian Foreign Ministry. We also have with us Mr. Ayman Refaie, who is the Director of the Carbons Credit Department at the Egyptian Environmental Egyptian Environmental Authority. And also we have with us online a number of colleagues from the European Commission, including Vicente, who I'll leave Moataz to introduce, but he heads the energy tax unit at the European Commission in Brussels. Today's discussion is as we hope, covering a very timely topic, which is the beginning of the implementation of the CBAM carbon tax mechanism, which, as we all know, will have implications on exports going into the European Union. The objective discussion today here is to understand better what exactly the European Commission has in mind. I know many of you have already been part of these discussions, but I think it's important to take stock of where the thinking is today. At the same time, we will have in the opening session discussions with Vicente, and then Dr. Mahmoud will respond, and then we will open it up for a Q&A, an interactive discussion. And in the second session, it's going to be a closed session for Egyptian interlocutors, Egyptian-based companies with Egyptian government officials to take stock in terms of what the Egyptian government thinks of the recent developments, how to expand the growth of the Egyptian industries, Egyptian exports, access to markets abroad, and also how to think about complying or engaging on this conversation on CBAM. And hopefully the objective of this discussion is to come out with a series of recommendations that we as LYNX, in addition to the industry players, can take and work with under the umbrella of hopefully the Federation of Egyptian Industries, to be able to put together a series of measures that can be taken to address and to be able to deal with this new development. Of course, we're very delighted to have with us this morning representatives of the industry players that are targeted and affected by the CBAM mechanism, whether companies from the fertilizer industry, whether companies from the iron steel, aluminium, cement, and also electricity and hydrogen. And of course, this event could not have happened today without the support and the sponsorship of our partners at Fertiglobe. So I want to thank you all again for coming here today. And I want to give the floor to our moderator for this morning, Mr. Moataz Yeken, the Senior Economic Consultant at LYNX, who will guide us through the 2 days through the full day of the discussion. And one final note, we are going to be pleased to be joined also in the second session by General Essam in Naggar, who is the head of the Egyptian Organization for Export and Import Control, to be able to also put us into perspective in terms of what the thinking is in the Ministry of Trade and Industry in terms of how to deal with this important development. With that, I'll leave the floor to Moataz to take us through the discussion. Thank you.
actually said it all about the importance and significance of this event, given that the EU is the largest trading partner with Egypt, and Egypt is a significant exporter to the EU for carbon-intensive products. So this is why we thought that having all stakeholders on the table discussing this new mechanism and its implication and how the private sector will be able to respond and adapt to this mechanism will be important. First, let us begin, as Mohamed mentioned, with Mr. Vicente Hurtado, the head of the Energy Taxation and other indirect taxes unit at the European Commission. He is an international taxation expert and had extensive experience in the Director General for Taxation for over 17 years. Mr. Vicente also served in the General Secretariat of the European Commission on the European semester and in relations with the European Council. Mr. Vicente will guide us through the CBAM, its definition, its application, what's meant by the CBAM, and the philosophy behind this tax. Please, Mr. Vicente, we are looking forward for your presentation.
Good morning, everyone, and I'm sorry that I could not make it to be with you. It would have been easier. You can see also that the technical problems happen very, very often, but there was no way for me to travel to Cairo this morning. My Director General, Gerasimos Thomas, responsible of the CBAM, he will be interested, of course, in going to Cairo and engaging with you, and maybe there will be opportunities very soon to do that also physically. In any case, I think it's important for us to give us the opportunity today to bring the CBAM to you a bit closer and to be able to explain the main designs of the measure, the timeline, the impacts, possible impacts, and also how to better prepare for the introduction of the CBAM. As your colleague or the presenter was saying before, we will introduce the measure already this October during a transitional period, but the financial obligations will only arrive in 2026. That's good because that gives us time to all of you, to us, to the industry around the world, to better understand CBAM, to get prepared for CBAM, and also, of course, to be able to adapt and to adjust where possible. I have prepared slides for my presentation of this morning, and I hope that they will work. I'm trying to share, but it says that host disabled participant screen sharing. So if you can allow me to share the slides. Or maybe someone can project the slides that I sent yesterday. Okay, now it seems to work. Thank you. Good. Can you see the slides on the screen?
Yes, but it's not yet in the presentation mode. So if you'd like to.
Yeah, I'm trying. Slideshow. Okay, good. Now?
Yes, it's clear.
Okay, perfect. I'm sorry for this. Okay, so as I was saying before, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, or as we usually call it, the CBAM, will come into application this October. But the first reporting obligations will only be from January. So there is still some time for us to explain and for you to better understand what is necessary during this transitional period. Before I say something about the design and about the impacts, I think maybe it's important to remember, to remind, and in particular to those of you who are not so familiar with the CBAM, a bit the context and the rationale why we are introducing this CBAM. I think it's important to say that in the European Union, we have one of the more straightforward and tight carbon pricing, which is our emission trading system, what we usually call the EU ETS, and which has been in place since around 2015, so quite a long time. Now, because of our new renewed level of ambition in order to reduce emissions by at least 55% by 2030 and to become carbon neutral by 2050, these are the engagements that the European Commission and the European Union has taken very recently. We still need to tighten the rules under the EU ETS, and we need to reinforce also the need and the rules for reducing greenhouse gases emissions. So we see the CBAM as a complement in order to help, well, first, the industry in the EU to become more greener and decarbonize more their processes. And also, and that's what we usually call to prevent the risk of carbon leakage, we understand, and I think it's easy to understand that cleaning the planet and fighting against climate change is an issue which concerns all of us. And there is no point in doing more in one corner of the planet if the rest of the planet will not be doing also their effort. And also in the auspices of the Paris Agreement, we think that there is a need in order to reinforce all policies around the world, and therefore the CBAM will also contribute and will help to reach those targets in the future. We have designed the CBAM in a way which is compatible with our WTO engagements. We don't discriminate. The intention is to apply the same carbon price that we have in the European Union for the production of EU goods to goods imported from third countries. So the idea, of course, is to make sure that goods which are sold on the EU market will play the same rules in terms of carbon pricing, regardless of the fact that they have been produced in the European Union or that they have been produced in a third country. So like this, it's clear that the mechanism will also have an incentive role to decarbonize around the world, to introduce carbon pricing, although this is not compulsory. But as you will see from the design of the measure, we understand also that the CBAM will be a powerful incentive to decarbonize not only the EU, but also around the world, and to introduce carbon pricing. The measure will be based on the actual carbon content of the imported goods. It's important to understand that the measure is not addressed at any particular country. We don't treat countries in a general way or differentiating one country from another. The measure targets only companies, and we will take into account how green that company is. In Egypt, like in many countries, like also in the European Union, you will have producers who produce with less emissions, and you will have producers who produce with more emissions. The greener they are, the lower will be the adjustment. And I think that's something which is important to remember or to bear in mind, because that will be, of course, a reward for those who decarbonize, who do efforts to decarbonize. At the same time, as I was saying before, we are mirroring our EU ETS, how it works. So in the same way that in the EU, the producers have to buy certificates which correspond to the emissions that they have produced at a price which is set by the auction every week. We will apply the same price to the imports from outside, and we will also give the opportunity to buy, in this case, the CBAM certificates at the price of the EU ETS, so same price, and there will be freedom to buy those certificates along the year in order to take advantage also of the fluctuation of the prices. So the measure that we have designed will be very similar to the measure that we apply in the European Union, with slight differences, because one measure applies to installations and the other measure, the CBAM, has to apply to goods, because we are importing goods. We are not importing whole productions of installations. But of course, the idea is that we apply and we treat in the same way all goods produced in the EU and imported from third countries. The measure, as you will see initially, will only focus on those carbon-intensive sectors. But those sectors are one of the most important sectors in Egypt when it comes in terms of exports to the EU. I was mentioning before that the measure will be introduced gradually. First, because we have a transitional phase until the end of 2025, where there will be no financial obligations, no need to buy CBAM certificates based on the embedded emissions of the imported goods. And this period, which already starts in this October, with the first reporting obligation in January, because the reporting will be on a quarterly basis, will allow us to collect data from the importers. The data will have to be submitted by the exporters. I will come to that point a bit later on in the presentation, but the idea is to collect data to understand, for us to understand how you measure your emissions, to understand also if you have a carbon price in your country, how it works, which type of carbon price, what type of level, also to understand how much we import of CBAM goods from different countries. At the same time, for you, also for exporters, it will give you the opportunity to introduce MRV options in case you don't monitor your emissions, to learn about the methodology that we want to apply for assessing the embedded emissions for the purpose of the CBAM, and also, of course, to start learning how to report those emissions. There won't be, that's a big difference between the transitional period and the final regime from 2026. There will not be any obligations for verification of the emissions by an external verifier. But of course, if you want to do that, that's also a way to already start getting better prepared for the final regime. But there will be monitoring and reporting obligations, but there won't be any verification nor financial obligations. For the moment, there is a limited number of sectors which are included in the measure, and I will project on the next slide the sectors. But the idea also is to analyze by 2025 how the system works, or how the system will be working from 2026. And the European Parliament and the European Council were very keen on assessing by 2025 the possibility of extending the measure to other sectors, including downstream sectors. For example, production of manufacturing of cars, so sectors which are intensive or which use intensively some of the basic raw materials which are already in the scope of the measure. From 2026, then the measure will apply with financial obligations. So importers of the CBAM goods will have to buy CBAM certificates according to the emissions which were released for the production of those imported goods. But again, it will be some sort of phase in, phase out of the CBAM, because as you possibly know, or maybe some of you know, in the European emission trading system, some of the sectors receive free allowances at this moment. So the full price is not paid by the EU industries. And the agreement was to phase out all these free allowances in the EU ETS from 2026 up to 2034 in a more or less gradual way. And these free allowances will also be granted to the imported goods. So as long as in the EU industry will be still benefiting for some of those free certificates will also be given to the importers of the CBAM goods. So we can say that the full effects of the CBAM will only be felt from 2034, although from 2030, the reduction of the free allowances will be around 48.5%. So the effects, we can say that the real effects of the CBAM will be really felt from 2030 onwards. As you can see, that gives us a lot of time on all of us, also on the EU industry, to prepare in order to cope with the reduction of the free allowances and to support, to bear a full ETS price. So this is a big incentive also on the EU industry and a big challenge on the EU industry to decarbonize. And at the same time, also that gives time to producers in third countries to position themselves to reduce emissions, and also on foreign governments to consider, for example, the introduction of carbon pricing. The sectors to which, for the moment, we apply the measures are cement, iron, steel, aluminium, fertilizers, electricity, and hydrogen. Hydrogen was not proposed by the European Commission initially, but the Parliament and the Council finally agreed also to include hydrogen. Although there are not many imports at this moment of electricity and hydrogen into the EU, as we advance with the electrification and we advance with our strategy to depend more and more on hydrogen, and in particular on clean hydrogen, on green hydrogen, rather than on fossil fuels, and the reduction of the dependency on natural gas, in particular, the importations of those products will become more and more relevant. So that's why already from now, we want to give a signal to the industries in third countries, and Africa and Egypt in particular also are good hubs for the production of clean electricity and clean hydrogen, and also your proximity to the EU, to the European continent, and for example, in particular to Greece. I know that there are some plans for connecting to Greece. This, of course, will give an opportunity to invest more and more on green electricity and green hydrogen in Egypt, but also in other countries. Those sectors, as you can imagine, I don't need to elaborate too much on that, but those sectors were, of course, selected, taking into account their high carbon emission intensity. With that, we are covering more than 45, I think more than 50% of the CO2 emissions of the ETS sectors in the EU, and also because it was there was a higher feasibility in terms of practical application to apply the CBAM to those goods. I will not hide, in case of those of you who are interested in the chemicals, for example, this is one of the sectors with, for example, also the plastics, which may be one of the next sectors to which the measure could be extended. The practicality problems with this sector is that there are a lot of products, a lot of production routes. While assessing the emissions of the installations is easier, assigning the emissions to every specific good, it's something which becomes a bit more difficult. As you can see here as well, and you know better than me, of course, Egypt is concerned with the production and the exports to the EU of some of these goods. Some of them are increasing their share also because of the new trade flows because of the war in Ukraine. It's the case of, for example, of fertilizers, where Egypt is becoming more and more an exporter of fertilizers to the European Union. At a glance, if we want to understand quickly how CBAM will work, and as I was saying before, we don't target countries, we target companies. We want to measure or to apply the measure to the companies according to their individual merits, taking into account the actual carbon content of the imported goods. We will allow them to take into account, of course, during this phase-in, phase-out from 2026 to 2034, to take into account the existence of free allowances in the EU ETS. So that will mitigate the initial impact also of the CBAM of the imported goods. And if there is a carbon price which has effectively been paid in the country of production, it could be an ETS, so an emission trading system like in the EU, or it could be any other type of carbon taxes, that carbon price will be, of course, taken into account, recognized, and will reduce the adjustment from the CBAM. We do that, of course, to acknowledge that a carbon price has been paid, and because we want to ensure that there is no double carbon price. That would be discriminatory, of course, and that would be something that we don't want to apply. So the companies from 2026, the imported companies, because the obligations fall on the importers, and that's important to understand, the companies that are importing the CBAM goods, for example, from Egypt, they will have to buy CBAM certificates at a price that will be set every week by the auctioning platforms for the European ETS. And then the CBAM certificates will have to be surrendered by May of the year after. So it's a very similar system to how the ETS works in the European Union, and that will be justified or supported by an annual declaration and by a certification by an external neutral verifier. But that will be only from 2026. In terms of emissions, And the scope of emissions at this moment is basically a scope 1, so direct emissions produced at the company site. So the emissions that are realized or released at the moment of the production of the goods. We also take into account at this stage a scope 2 or indirect emissions, which are the ones which correspond to the electricity or the emissions for the production of the electricity, which is consumed in the production of the goods. So this is what we usually call indirect emissions or scope 2 emissions. But for the moment, those emissions only count for 2 sectors, cement and fertilizers. The idea by 2025 is to also extend those emissions to all the other sectors. And this is in particular very, very relevant for those, and you will know, those of you who produce aluminium, because in the case of aluminium, around roughly 40% of the total emissions correspond to scope 2 emissions from the production of electricity. We also take into account some of what we usually call scope 3 indirect emissions, which are the emissions, for example, from the production of some input materials. That's in the case of some complex goods, but that's all very, very narrow scope and only for very, very precise goods. All the other emissions, from the well or destruction of the minerals up to the delivery, for example, the transportation of the goods, they are usually called scope 3 emissions. They are not taken into account in the scope of the measure, and we don't think that the idea is to take them into account, but there will be some reflections from now until 2025 whether the whole life cycle emissions can be included in the CBAM. Important to come with one idea: direct emissions, of course, in the scope, indirect emissions from the production of electricity, for the moment only in the case of the cement and the fertilizer sectors, but there is an intention to include also for all the other sectors by 2026. As I was saying before, if a carbon price has been paid in advance at the source, in the way of an ETS or in the form of a carbon tax, that will be, of course, reflected in the number of certificates that have to be bought in order to reduce, of course, the burden. We don't want to have a double carbon price. In a nutshell, this is the formula, those who love formulas for the calculation of the adjustment. So first of all, you need to buy, or the importer of the CBAM goods will have to buy a number of certificates which will be based on the number of actual emissions produced or emitted for the production of the goods, and they will be set as tons of CO2 per ton of product produced. During this period from 2026 to 2033, there will be free allowances in the EU. So the level of these free allowances can be deducted from those emissions. So basically, the idea is that the benchmark for free allowances in the EU, which is here, if you have more emissions above those benchmarks, you will have to buy certificates according to the gap or to the excess of the emissions corresponding to the benchmark. If you are below the benchmark of the EU benchmark for free allowances at that moment in that particular year, you don't have to buy CBAM certificates and you don't have to pay an adjustment. You multiply, of course, this by the total tons of imported goods, and then you will have to buy, or you can buy along the year according to an average weekly price of the EU ETS. That means that the price is not always the same. It fluctuates along the year. As you possibly know now, the price of the EU ETS is roughly between 90 and 95 euros per ton of CO2 emitted per ton of product, but that price has been fluctuating and will continue fluctuating. The expectations is that as we move forward and we progress with a lower level of emissions, and then the price of the EU ETS may increase. And finally, if a carbon price has been paid, in this case in Egypt, this carbon price can be, of course, deducted, and that gives us the final adjustment. As I was saying before, I have said several times, we start now with a transitional period. The final regime with these obligations to buy certificates will only arrive in 2026. But since then, since now, from October, there will be, of course, a learning curve for everyone, for us, but also for the industries in third countries exporting CBAM goods to the EU, in order to understand. We are developing, and I will give you the website or the link to the website where you will find all the information. We are, of course, developing all type of trainings and webinars. We are organizing webinars also per sectors, starting with the cement sector this week, in order to learn how to apply CBAM during the transitional period. We will only be collecting information, and during this transitional period, in particular in 2024, there will be some reporting flexibilities also for you to have more time to get to know the CBAM. So in a nutshell, who is responsible for the reporting? The importer. Like in the final regime, it will be the importer who will have to register in the CBAM transitional registry, according to where they are established, in which member state they are established, but there will be a full, of course, interoperability and connection between all member states, customs authorities, and the Commission in order to get and circulate this information. And the exporter will have, of course, you know how much you emit, you know how much are the indirect emissions in case of the electricity. For example, if you have signed a PPA, this can be recognized, and this can, of course, reduce the amount of the adjustment. And that information will have to flow to the importer, but the importer is the one who has to register and who has to report all this information every quarter. For the first period, then the obligation for reporting will be in January next year, and then every 3 months, every 3 months, there will be an obligation for submitting information on the goods which have been imported in the previous quarter. We will have flexibility for the first reporting periods. In principle, there are possibilities for amendments in case that something has been done incorrectly, or you realize that you missed some information. So that's always possible. From January to April 2024, the modifications will be allowed until July 2024. So for the first 2 reporting periods, we will give still more flexibility. And then also after the deadlines, there is always the possibility for reopening the resubmission and correct the reports. Your role, as I was saying before, is to monitor and collect the data. So for the exporting companies, you will need to communicate this data. And during the transitional period, there is no obligation for verification. But if you want to start verifying those emissions, of course, we will be happy also to receive your verification reports. The reporting obligations will be, the information that has to be reported is, of course, quantity of goods, where the installations are located, what are the production routes or the parameters for the emissions. Of course, the direct and indirect emissions produced for the product or released for the production of the CBAM goods, and if any carbon price has been paid, we want to know how much, how it has been paid, in which way, which type of measure, etc. We know that we are coming late with or we are coming too close to the start of the transitional period with our transitional methodology. The methodology was adopted or published in our website on the 17th of August. So for that reason, until the end of 2024, we will allow importers and exporters in that case to report their emissions based on one of the 3 systems here, on any carbon pricing scheme which is applicable in the country of origin, or if there is any other compulsory emission monitoring scheme, or of course also if there is an emission monitoring scheme at the level of installation, which is, for example, verified by an external verifier. So during that time, we will allow you to use that methodology instead of using the Commission's methodology. From 2025 or in 2025, we want you to use the Commission's methodology. You will see that our methodology has the aspiration of becoming some sort of international. It's based on the EU's ETS methodology, but adapted to the specific case of the CBAM and the specific case of applying to CBAM goods. We launched, or we set up an expert group 1 year ago with EU industry, with experts on measuring emissions. And also there was the possibility for third countries to become observers to this group. Now we will relaunch the group again. And I mean, if Egypt is interested in participating in this group in order to follow developments on the development, I mean, on the future methodology for the CBAM, that's something that we will, of course, appreciate. Until the end of July 2024, there will be also the possibility to use other reference methods, for example, some sort of default values. We are going to publish default values in 1 or 2 weeks. These will be some sort of averages, worldwide averages of emission intensities. From 2026, there will be also default values for those cases where it's impossible or there is no trustable information on the actual emissions produced or released at the moment of the production of the CBAM goods. But in that case, from 2026, we will use some sort of averages per country. But now for the moment, and until July 2024, you will also be able to rely on those international averages that are being prepared with the support of our joint research center based on information in particular from, for example, the International Energy Agency. And then in order to also give more flexibility, up to 20% of the total embedded emissions in the case of complex goods can be based on some sort of estimates, like including, for example, also the default values. So as you can see, we try to smoothly introduce CBAM so that everyone can catch up, can understand CBAM, and can adapt, of course, with introducing monitoring and reporting. Because we know that not all companies around the world, not all countries around the world already have monitoring and reporting, and therefore for them it will be a bigger challenge, of course, to measure their emissions. In order to support all that, as I was saying before, we are launching trainings. We have already online some sort of e-learnings, and we are also launching 6 webinars for each of the sectors starting from this week. The first webinar will be on the 15th of September on the cement, for the cement sector. They will be recorded. If you don't have the possibility to register and to participate, no worries, because they will be recorded. But of course, if you participate, you will have the chance also to put questions and to have a more lively discussion with my colleagues. We have also produced guidance, tailored guidance on how to monitor and report the emissions according to the CBAM methodology. And we are, of course, working on templates and a dedicated information portal for the reporting. The IT platform is being finalized as we speak this morning, so it should be ready by the beginning of the transitional period, although it's not necessary until January of next year. But I think that it will help everyone to understand how to report and how to apply CBAM during the transitional period. All this information about the webinars, trainings, the guidance for reporting, and etc., you will find it in this link that is now on the screen. The slides have been shared with the organizers, so I'm happy if they all, of course, can circulate to all the participants to this event today. Let me just finalize, and sorry for taking a bit long, but I think it's important, and I would like to convey those messages, although I have already been saying that during the presentation. But I think it's important to underline the opportunity that CBAM brings. We are sometimes approached by producers in third countries, by some countries saying that CBAM is a unilateral measure that will introduce trade or administrative burdens. But I think it's important to understand that it's also an opportunity. I think that it's clear the direction that all countries here in the world have to take or are taking, not only under the Paris Agreement or because in compliance with the NDC's nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement, but also because I think that we are all more and more conscious that we need to decarbonize. There is no planet B. That's what we hear. There is no planet or plan B, as we hear very often. And I think that it's in the benefit of all of us, of course, to decarbonize. And also for all companies, not only multinationals, but also medium and small companies around the world. They have understood that the direction they have to follow and the way also to attract investments, of course, is also to become greener. Introducing carbon pricing, before I come to the point on the industry, and that's a message for policymakers. Introducing carbon pricing is also an effective way to better monitor and understand and have a better understanding of the level of carbon intensity in the country. But at the same time, and that's true, it's the best way also to bring fresh revenues to support the green transition in all countries. This is what we do in the EU ETS. We collect the money, we collect the revenues, and those revenues can be channeled through a modernization or through innovation funds in order to support also the EU industry to decarbonize and to support also the most vulnerable in terms of citizens, also in terms of industry. We don't want the money from the third countries. Sometimes they say that we introduce CBAM because we want to collect revenues. That's not the objective. That's not the idea. We will be happy if everyone reduces emissions. We will be happy, of course, if everyone introduces carbon pricing, and you will keep those revenues. And I think that's something which is acceptable and which is also something that we really want to promote. And in particular, if those revenues are recycled and reused to support green industries. I will give you an example. If you look at the case of Turkey, they are now considering introducing, or they are going to introduce a carbon price or a sort of ETS from 2024. It will be first a pilot project, and it's not a surprise to see that the sectors which will be covered initially are mostly the sectors which are, of course, in the CBAM. These are also the sectors which are heavier polluters or emitters of greenhouse gases emissions, but they are also the sectors which are subject to the CBAM. So if you introduce carbon pricing in Egypt, or you reinforce your carbon pricing, in the case of many other countries, that will allow you to keep the revenues and to use them to support your industries. In the case of the industry, introducing monitoring and reporting will help them to understand their emissions, will help them how to reduce also to their emissions, and will help them in the future to become more competitiveness. And because more and more international companies will be more interested in supporting greener companies, not in supporting dirtier companies. So the more you do to decarbonize, the more you will allow, or you will get investment, fresh investment for greener activities. There is an opportunity for a country like Egypt to decarbonize. I know that the government is making efforts and is making plans how to decarbonize, how to attract international investment, which is important for Egypt, but also for many other countries, to your industry, to improve to reduce unemployment, and also to support your industrialization. And this is a crucial opportunity to do that. Attracting green technologies will help you in the future. Producing green electricity, producing green hydrogen will not only help you to export those products to the EU, but will also benefit the local industry, the local production, and the attraction, of course, of investments from third countries. And with this, I would like to finalize my presentation. And once again, thanks a lot for this great opportunity to bring CBAM closer to you. The objectives with the introduction of the CBAM, the design of the CBAM, and also the opportunity that CBAM will bring, or decarbonization in general will bring, to attract investments in a country like Egypt. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Vicente. And Thank you very much for this thorough presentation, and we will share the presentation with all participants. Your presentation gave us a lot of information and knowledge about the mechanism. However, it triggers a lot of many questions with regard to the implied requirements that are capital intensive and maybe very high tech, and the know-how is very specialized. So Egypt has the right to maintain its chances in growth. And actually, Egypt is now also not only the fertilizers and other commodities which are important exports to the European Union, but also Egypt is now turning to be a hub for hydrogen production. So it's a new path for development that we are looking for, so that we respond to our development needs. So these implications and questions would lead us to welcome our honorable guest, Dr. Mohieldin. He is the UN Climate Change High-Level Champion for Egypt since February 2022. He is also, since February 2020, has been the United Nations Special Envoy on financing the 2030 Development Agenda. Dr. Mahmoud is our former Minister of Investment between 2004 and 2010. Most recently, he served as the World Bank Group Senior Vice President for the 2030 Development Agenda, United Nations Relations and Partnerships. He's also a professor of economics at the Faculty of Economics and Political Science in Cairo University, and a visiting professor at several renowned universities in Egypt, Korea, the UAE, the UK, and the US. So welcome, Dr. Mahmoud, and we are looking forward for your opinion and comments on the mechanism and how can Egypt respond and adapt to this new mechanism.
Right. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Well, thank you so much, Mr. Hanafi, Mr. Yeken, and Vicente for this excellent presentation and an opportunity to discuss an important matter. Well, we say it's never too late, but I think it's very much too late for many discussing this issue now. But preparations may have been taking place already at some of the active corporate leaders in this country and other developing economies, but not necessarily at the scale and scope that this very demanding new instrument is going to entail. In a good day, one would say, if this new mechanism and approach are going to enhance trade relations, improve investments, substantiate significant growth momentum, create jobs, reduce poverty, this would be very much welcome. But I'm afraid this is very much the opposite of all of that. It's the right to advance economies to consider all measures and policies to enhance their economies, to protect environment, and to do what they can in climate action. And I'm very much pleased that this kind of discovery, after a couple of 100 years of emissions, pollutions, destroying the planet in different ways by the advanced economies and now by some of the emerging markets recently, not one of them is Egypt, that some measures of mitigation are being considered. I'm very pleased for a country to consider taking measures like heavy subsidies in the United States without calling it subsidies under the IRA. And this is good for the United States, but definitely not necessarily good for United States partners. And it's fine as well across the Atlantic for Europe to consider different measures of taxation. This is definitely could be and should be actually, given that had been pioneered by the Europeans for the Europeans. It should be with good welfare impact on Europe, but not necessarily so on the partners, including in the Mediterranean and Africa. So it shouldn't really be expected that what's good for Europe or what's good for the advanced economies should be celebrated from a developing economy perspective, unless it's going to be fully absorbed, fully taking care of all of its details. But I haven't really seen so far one piece of neutral assessment of the impact of CBAM, including the easy to read, easy to comprehend pieces, in like what we have seen recently in the op-eds of Project Syndicate. I cite 3 of them that I asked colleagues to print for me. One is by 2 Stanford economists saying that the EU's carbon border tax could hurt developing countries. And they have some nice explanations of that by the negative spillover effects. And they call it what our friends in the EU doesn't like to call it. It's not a levy, it's not tax, it's not for revenue, it's for climate and environment. We cannot call it whatever we like, but the impact is tax-like kind of an impact. Another piece, although that it has been perhaps confusing itself with which organization that they can seek help from. This is by 3 authors from different countries, including Kevin Gallagher. And they say that international institutions, including the IMF, needs to mitigate the climate transition risk. And they say that the ambitious climate policies to replace fossil fuels with clean energy sources will benefit all if only the transition spillover risks are going to be coordinated and accommodated. Another one by a good friend, this time by Jayati Josh, a very well-known economist in India and the US. And she's putting it clearly that, which I'm going to elaborate more on, that by taxing imports to the EU, the CBAM, and she is calling it taxes like others like to call it taxes. I know it's not very popular to call it that way, but this is the impact perspective. The CBAM imposes on exporters in other countries the nearly impossible task of measuring emissions, which is the issue of measurement, monitoring, and reviewing that was mentioned in this excellent presentation. Most developing countries and many developed ones lack granular data on firm-specific emissions, not to mention the ability to track the emissions of all inputs used. Even if such data were available, the costs of collecting, analyzing it over time would be enormous. And she quotes, and I'm quoting here, but she quotes the UNCTAD recent report that CBAM attempts to impose on developing countries the environmental standard that developed countries are choosing. Is that compatible with Paris Agreement? Is that compatible with the CBDR expectations? Is it? I'm happy that in different reports, including this excellent presentation, issues related to compliance with WTO had been mentioned, but I haven't seen a clean, clear statement yet from the WTO to say that. And this could be the issue that we, as partners from the advanced economies in Europe and the developing economies, we seek this kind of neutral kind of assessment. I know recently there had been a discussion, and I thank the ambassadors with us here, Ambassador Nasr and Ambassador Eish, and they are leaders in their work on climate, environment, and partnerships. They can really reflect on that. But in recent discussions in Geneva by the representatives of the African group, there have been some good question marks about the full compatibility with WTO. It's a question mark. I have that question. The Europe says it's compatible, some, including me, and others have doubts. So we need really to have this kind of clear perspective from the WTO. On partnership with Europe, I think many years, one of the first engagement I had when I returned to Egypt in the 1990s was to help in my capacity as advisor to ministers at the time, a junior advisor, and I was proud of that at the time, to help the partnership unit led by Ambassador Gamal Bayoumi, that was during the time of Excellency Amr Moussa, in many missions, many discussions, but in the spirit of partnership that I'm not necessarily seeing it reflected in all aspects of work, including in the design of policy that could impact the closest partners on trade, investment, migration, voluntary, forced, and tourism, and all. So this is, I think, in the spirit of good cooperation between Europe and its African neighbors, including Egypt. Perhaps with this kind of fast-changing world, we need really to have another look on the merits, impact, and real value of this partnership, that we have to revise it in the way that could be mutually beneficial. So I wish I was able to say that the CBAM is going to improve my trade, my investment, my growth, my poverty level to be less, but it is not really going to contribute to all of that. And I'm always worried, coming from an institution of many years, World Bank and then the IMF and of course the UN, these institutions don't just lend money and provide technical assistance, but we know that they provide knowledge and do some capacity development and training in different ways. There is an issue, and let's just confront reality here. If I'm not quite sure that the EU can really respond to all demands from companies, sectors, countries, at the same time asking for technical assistance and capacity development of what it requires. There are budget constraints in the EU. There are budget constraints even in the formidable IFIs that I work in one of them. And I know that you apply, you wait, there is a queue. And then during that, there are some certain dynamics that could really tell me what this kind of capacity development, training, and technical assistance for reporting would entail at the end. If anybody is happy, and I had a good discussion with a very good friend, one of the top lawyers in the country, I can tell you, in all kind of problems, in all kind of disruptions, even in disasters, wars, and even death, there is some beneficiary somewhere. So the lawyers in the room, the consultants in the room, the accountants, the reviewers, this could be your start of a happy time, because that will be bringing to you a lot of benefit and a lot of gains as consultants to the many impacted industries of that. Those who have doubts, they will ask you for to clarify if they have doubts. But those who are going to be reporting, definitely they will ask you for that. For anyone who run a business or worked with businesses, I don't really work with grace periods. If you announce that something will happen in 2030, I have to discount it now. It should be factored in my books. Otherwise, the CEO of the company, she or he, are not worth their salt. So if it is coming in sometime in 26, but now I have grace period of 2 years, yes, it looks like a nice grace period for reporting, for alignments, for fixing errors, for adjusting mechanisms. But they have to put from now, especially for listed companies, they have to put from now the kind of provisions that allow them to protect themselves and their shareholders. So the cost will be realized immediately, even if the impact is going to be realized in the future. When I had the pleasure of meeting colleagues and friends, and many of them I know for many years, and many of them even were with me in school in Brussels, I saw them happy. Of course, they are doing something good for their countries. They should be happy and proud, as I should really be one day happy for their counterparts in our developing economies if they are doing something similar with less impact on their economies and societies. And they have seen some serious demand coming from them, these units, including the department that our main speaker is working for, are going to be very popular in demand. You'll be getting lots of emails and many phone calls and many requests for meetings. And perhaps the budget for the department needs really to be enhanced. It's not necessarily so in the counterparts because they are facing major budget constraints. This is the kind of political economy dynamics that are likely to see the issues of climate action. I'm a climate activist by appointment as a climate champion. So anything that could reduce emissions, I have to celebrate. But at the same time, this country, Egypt, had shown the world that we cannot do climate action at the expense of development. We cannot solve climate crisis by development crisis. I cannot solve climate trade and climate finance problems by creating a trade crisis or a debt crisis. But I'm seeing all of these crises looming without necessarily fixing the climate problem, because it's coming and originating from bad behavior, bad consumption, bad production, conducted still until now by the EU and other jurisdictions, including the huge subsidies on fossil fuel. The total share of the share specific to the EU is not on the top of my mind, but we know from $6 to $7 trillion of subsidies during this hour of the day. If the 2 hours of the seminar will be spending more than $1.4 billion globally on fossil fuel. So that could be a better way without really disruption and destruction in the trade dynamics. They are suffering as they are from many protectionist measures. It's really very much strange for someone who's trying to make as many shields to protect trade from liberalization with Europe in 1990s. Now, it seems to me like me and others are more believers in trade liberalization and movement of trade and investments than the gurus of trade and investment. The world is changing, and it's changing very fast. So what can I say? There is a presentation. It will still be under improvement, so I'll share it later. But please, we can go through it super fast, because at least the 4 or 5 slides were covered by our excellent speaker earlier, and congratulate him for his very clean and clear explanation of the CBAM and its implications. And whether it's a threat or an opportunity, I see more of a threat than an opportunity. We are getting used more to the cost than the benefits recently in this world. There is nothing new I would add here in the first slide. It's basically about what you just mentioned. And this could be a kind of an eye test for some of you. But the CBAM is there in part of this this pyramid. It could be clearer, perhaps, if you are watching via Zoom. But here, this is coming in a kind of an ecosystem of different levies and subsidies. So the European Green Deal, there is a plastic tax, energy taxation directive, CO2 border price adjustment mechanism that is being discussed today, and the EU emissions trading systems, the ETS. And that is the kind of ecosystem that you need if you are dealing with Europe to get all of that and beyond, because there are other measures being undertaken. Fantastic for Europe, but not necessarily all for the trading partners. The claims, as we have heard, that they prevent carbon leakage, complement and reinforce the EU ETS, leveling the playing field between the domestic European producers and those who are like us exporting to Europe, contribute to decarbonize globally. Yes, Europe is a leader in climate action in many aspects, and that definitely will have its own dynamics. They don't say it is a trade measure, but rather an environmental and climate measure. Well, but effectively, it would be. This could be one of the unintended consequences. It will be an environmental and climate measure indeed, but it's a trade and fiscal, with trade and fiscal impact definitely there. Not addressed at countries, but individual producers. Yes, but country at the end is full of companies. This is the production sector of a country. If the steel, fertilizers, aluminum, cement producers of Egypt are going to be impacted, this is definitely will impact the country. I'm not going to exaggerate. I hope one day we'll have these companies that we can one day, as the American mentioned, what's good for General Motors is good for America. I wish that we can have this kind of size of companies that we can be proud of one day. It's happening one day. Aligning with the EU's international policies, agreements, and legal commitments, including the WTO. This is a claim. This is a claim that needs to be challenged by every developing partner. The EU did its exercise, its own reading. It's fair for them to say that, but it is wrong just to take it that way. And then good luck in covering scope 1, scope 2, and scope. What about scope 3, which is basically still under a great deal of confusion of understanding. Next, please. Well, this is again just for confirmation. Sorry for repetition, but this is new for many of us. So perhaps repetition doesn't cause much of harm here. No, back again to the slide. Yeah. Don't dance too much with that. Thank you. It's good that this horror door in the back is now open. So enough horror for the day. So cement, iron, steel, aluminum, fertilizers, hydrogen, and electricity. Hydrogen, yes, we export part, not really the kind of type of hydrogen that Mr. Yeken was mentioning. The green hydrogen is in its way, I hope. But this, can I open brackets here for the green hydrogen, because this has a great deal of potential. And many of the MOUs signed had a kind of EU dimension to them. What worries me, coming from a developing economy, that energy strategy and policy in Europe is not that stable. So for everybody who is working in this area, they need really to make sure that the contractual obligations are very clear, because it's even personalized sometimes. Many of us were happy that Mr. Timmermans have been really very active and promoting green hydrogen as area of partnership. Now he's doing something else. The issue of stability of the energy strategy of Europe needs to be emphasized, because it's not just about the cost of the project, it's about the cost of infrastructure to support it and the kind of direction related to it. Well, this is in each and every sector of these, there is a story behind the sector, and there is a story behind the corporates, and there is a story for the country at large. So it is not really right to say that it is not against countries. It's to do with companies, but if the impact is negative, the country is harmed. Cement, well, it's one of our major exports. Iron, steel, fertilizers were not that significant as they are today, but during the last couple of years, they have increased enormously. Next, please. Right, this is something, you know, in order to get this kind of simple, basic information, and this is not really the kind of nitty-gritty kind of detailed, granular data that our speaker was talking about when he was talking about reporting. This even something that you can get simply. With two colleagues working hard during the last few days just to find the data on the EU relations with Egypt from Egyptian perspective in terms of exports. It's hard, it's confusing, many sources coming from different sources. There is central bank and there is CAPMAS, and there are some websites affiliated with ministries, and then you have perhaps double check with the World Bank in order to make sure that the data makes sense. But in all cases, yeah, they make sense at the end, and there is significant trade with Europe. When it comes to exports, the EU is still our major trading partner in merchandise exports, and the importance of these sectors cannot really be undermined. You can always take it, yes, it's at the end of the day, it's not all of your exports, and you will negotiate, but there will be impact on companies and corporates and their dynamics of competition, but there will be implications. Next, please. And here, of the 6 sectors covered under CBAM, Egypt is among the top 10 exporters of fertilizers, but that is recent, could continue, and that increase and enhance after the war in the Ukraine. But this gives you some indication. Cement as well is still significant. Next, please. And then the cement sector in particular now has major investors. Many of them happen to be from Europe directly or indirectly. And this chart is basically putting Egypt there as the top country, one of the top 10 countries exposed to CBAM. And then there is another way. If you are getting close to red, you are in trouble. And here, you cannot really deny it. That we are in terms of the CBAM exposure index by the World Bank, which is considering matters from a relative perspective. Absolute as well can tell you something from that perspective. Next, please. So then the issue of, yes, quoting the EU, as mentioned by our speaker, the ultimate objective of CBAM is broad product coverage. If the scope of CBAM is expanded over time, and it will, the impact will be even higher. So we need to be prepared. Trade, investment, economies are not static based on promises that you hear in 23. You need really to go beyond that. What will happen 10 years from now? And then the issues about the ETS and its coverage, obviously heat generation, energy intensive industry, focusing on scope 2 emissions in particular, but then that could really be expanded further in the future. So we need to be prepared for what's coming. Next, please. So here, well, I wish that you can see that. I hope that your eyesight is better than mine. So that had to be tested before, but that will be shared. It's basically about the share of CBAM bound products that is subject to a carbon adjustment fee. And here you can see almost 38% are basically subject to this kind of the share of the CBAM bound products. More than 3/4 of Egypt's aluminum exports, for instance, have EU as the destination. So aluminum, in that order, aluminum is the highest exposed, iron, steel, next, hydrogen as it stands today, and then fertilizers, cement, and then electricity. Perhaps we didn't get data, or we are not exporting electricity. That needs to be verified. And then carbon emission intensity of exports. This is the next slide, please. You can see this is beyond the exposure of the sector. It's the exposure of the sector based on the level of carbon intensity. In this case, aluminum could be better relatively here than fertilizers, and iron steel comes after fertilizers in that perspective. The measure is based on the carbon emission intensity of exports, kilogram per US dollar. Next, please. So technical details, I'm happy that the speaker covered many of them, including the what involved the use of different methods. And here that is basically, each one of them requires training, intensive training on monitoring, reporting, and verification system. So good luck with that. Next. So potential pathways, there are many things being written there. I would say we can really consider the following. The first I mentioned is the WTO compliance aspects, and that needs really to be tackled. And we have very able and competent team in Geneva, led by Ambassador Ihab Gamaluddin, and I know that he's working just to get the clarification. It's not just him alone, it's African economies as well. So one day we can really get something clear, not an Egyptian view on WTO, not a European view on WTO, but WTO on WTO, what they see of this matter in particular. This could be a first entry point. The second, is it a challenge to the spirit, philosophy, dynamics of the partnership agreement? We have the ambassador responsible for this part, and there could be mechanisms of mitigation, of better paths or pathways, because that partnership agreement took years to be established in order to safeguard our economic, political, and historical and cultural relations with Europe from disruptions like these. This is disruption. and disruptions are not always bad. It's good for the EU, but not necessarily so for Egypt. The translation of disruption is more biket. There is a whole book that I wrote about that, so it brings something to mind there. So after we finish WTO and then the regional work, perhaps you can go to the next slide, please. Yes, there is something called decarbonization mentioned by our speaker. And here, this could be something that we should be insisting on today. When we're in Sharm el-Sheikh, we're just saying, yes, please do help us in decarbonization. We have been talking to the G7, of which many European members are there and very influential, that the matter shouldn't really be stopping at the efforts towards decarbonizing countries that are heavy dependent on coal, like South Africa or Indonesia or Vietnam. Senegal is not that heavy on coal, but they are seeking investments in renewables. I've been telling our European friends, and it's great as well, I'd like to recognize in the room Mr. Paul Giblin, who the new Environment, Science, Technology, and Health Officer in the Embassy of the United States, who just arrived in Egypt. Welcome to this great country. And again, US with Europe, and then you can add always Japan and Canada for the completion of the G7 are responsible for the JETP. We see the trouble. We have here cement leaders, the Federation of Egyptian Industries here, cement leaders, fertilizers, and steel, mainly led by the private sector, by the way. It's not government. It's not state-owned. It's all private sector in joint ventures, saying that we are ready as business leaders to help in the decarbonization of these hard-to-abate sectors using the language of the climate action and the Paris Agreement. But until this very moment, we haven't really seen sufficient attention being paid to these sectors. Now I see these sectors of my country are highly exposed, and I'm not getting the billions promised to my brothers in Vietnam or South Africa, Indonesia, and Senegal. And I know that in different extents, some of them are faster than others on that. As part of the work that I'm chair of GFANZ Africa with my good friend Mark Carney, he has been working hard in his position in order to make the case for us in decarbonization of the hard-to-abate sector. This is much more important than any kind of compensation that could come down the road. We don't need compensation. We don't need more training. We don't need more consultants. What we need is action in the field, in the real economy, to help these industries to decarbonize now. The technology is there, the investment is there, and I cannot talk on behalf of the industry while the Federation is here, and they are keen to do something, private sector to private sector, with the help of EU, and in a good day as well with the US, will be in business. Next. So this is one, so I said WTO, regional partnership. Then you go into the impacted sectors, not to help them reporting. This will happen perhaps in the short term, but you need to help them assist, cooperate, for mutual benefit and share prosperity for them to decarbonize. Then there is something that we can do, but this needs some serious consideration. And I hope that our excellent speaker can help us with that. We are building, I don't know if there is anybody from FRA or the Egyptian Exchange are here or invited, but I know that Mohamed Farid and his colleagues are working hard to establish the carbon market, the voluntary carbon market for Egypt. There is consideration for compliance market. I'm proud that the idea of ACME, African Carbon Market Initiative, I initiated with my colleagues while we were in the Climate Week in Addis. I got, my colleagues here didn't capture all the information, but I got it to you from Nairobi, that this is a fast changing world, as I said. So in terms of ambitions by 2030, we are expecting that 300 tons of CO2 will be retired, metric tons. 6 billion capital will be mobilized. Around 30 million jobs could be created by the year 2030. This is not our figures. This is coming from Sustainable Energy for All, Rockefeller Foundation, by Vera, the gurus in this area of work. USAID is involved in this, so for the benefit of our US partners, this is an initiative on establishing carbon market, trying to use European standards because it's very advanced there, including compared to the American one. And now we need really to have more countries involved. This will be great. And actually, I remember that Madame Ursula, when she was presenting the CBAM, and I like the EU, they are very much black and white. It's coming, it's happening. Adjust your self-report and we'll train you, and we can pray together as well if you like. But they said that in Glasgow, and she said, well, please decarbonize. She was very honest. Decarbonize or capture the value at home. Otherwise, the value will be captured in Europe. Please refer to her YouTube in Glasgow. She was as frank and direct as our good speaker today. What we need here is basically to take this black and white reality. Is not some of my colleagues, no, they cannot do that to us. Well, they are doing something good for themselves. The spillovers, the negatives, it's good luck. They are just marching on. You are not there, but you need to know that you are there, because you need to speak the same language, provide the technical challenge, remind them of the rules of the game. It's WTO, it's partnership, it's new methods of decarbonization, it's carbon markets. It's not really Mazlumiyya, it's not begging for help, nothing of that. It's business to business, based on standards and rules of the game, that this needs really to be applied accordingly. And we have a couple of years of full implementation. Next, please. And then this could be a summary of the points of concern. I think our excellent speaker have seen them, have heard them before in different ways, perhaps for more of repetition. Again, WTO, we need to knock on their doors. And actually, this is one sad part. Because of the tough geopolitics, one of the best organizations to protect free trade, rules-based, that had been led by the US and Europe and others. I remember the day that I was receiving letters of support from the US and the EU to help countries like China and Russia to be members of the WTO. Now the WTO is being weakened. The rules are not applying. The dispute mechanism is not there. Matters are very much slow in that, because the geopolitics have been brought in the WTO, which is led by one of the best gurus of multilateralism, my good friend Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. But what the director of the WTO can do if the members are not interested in helping themselves? But we need to go to the WTO. Again, I mentioned the European partnership, and then we can definitely, if you are in business, you need to assess two things: explicit costs in the different scopes and compliance procedure, as mentioned by the speaker, but in all scopes, not now, but for the future implications as well. While you are at it, it could be a blessing in disguise. Get your act together and start doing it. It's costly. So if you go to your CEO, it's not really cost-free. It's costly, and the good mind that can help you in the legal, administrative, reporting do not come free. Unless the EU will be generous in subsidizing that, that would be good. But in order to go that through a process, you will be already in 26 and beyond. So you need to start in 2020. Can you go back to time? That would be nice. Only in movies and in our dreams. And then in the implicit cost, legal, administrative, and capacity, yes, I said that, so we need to emphasize. And then, will my carbon certificates be good enough for Europe? Can we go and check why our carbon markets are not moving fast? That could be an area of work. I mentioned decarbonization, and then I said something about special arrangements. I hate exceptions. I hate allowances. I hate these kind of temporary provisions, but seem that we need to consider them until we get some sort of a level playing field established. But two things as well for the consideration of the Trade Department, not the Tax Department of the EU. There is something called competition. There is something called contestability. There is something called trade diversion. If there are more implicit and explicit barriers to trade are going to be established in the EU, the world is big. It takes time. It will not be like a switch. You are exporting to Europe tomorrow. in order to export to Africa or to Asia or to Latin America. But now we need to internalize all of these kind of explicit costs, because the proximity of Europe might be compromised by some imposed tariffs. They are you can consider they are levies. There are X kind of extra costs on the transaction with Europe. So that will have implications. So I think this, while I'm super pleased with this presentation, this is one of the best presentations I attended many of them. I shared some of them with my colleagues, but the presentation shared to you today, it's doesn't play games, straightforward, but this is a European proposal that requires an African counterpart, that requires an Egyptian counterpart, or counter proposal, or the counterpart prepares the counter proposal. And then again, the problems of climate and the problems of development will not be solved but by three things that requires collaboration, and Europe has almost all of them. Finance, still, despite the budget constraints. Technology, yes, there are many challenges in your comparative advantage in Europe vis-a-vis the US or China or some of the emerging players in Asia, but Europe still a custodian of intellects and technology and innovation. This is an area of cooperation. And third, incentives. I think you left finance, you left technology cooperation, and in incentives, you only used negative incentives that are going to have very serious implications. This is serious work. It's going to be a game changer at the corporate level. Don't really take it easy. Don't consume time wandering around in the grace period. The act needs to be immediate between the business sector of Egypt, between the consultancy firms of Egypt, and definitely between everybody who still cares about trade, investment, and growth, and fighting poverty in this country. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mahmoud, for this insightful and eye-opener presentation. Actually, Dr. Mahmoud voiced the concerns of developing countries and in Egypt as well. And he mentioned the balance between the development priorities and the climate change challenge, especially that Egypt and other developing countries are not really responsible for much of the climate change, but they are highly affected with the impact of climate change. So thank you, Dr. Mahmoud, for raising these critical points, and thank you for the advice for the private sector to act and the advice for the country to act. And we need really to utilize the available time slot to be effectively ready for the implementation of the mechanism before it's too late. Before I open the floor for Q's and A's, I would like to have a question for the Ambassador Mohamed Nasr. Ambassador Mohamed Nasr is the Director of the Department for Environment, Climate Change and Sustainable Development at the Egyptian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I would quote what Dr. Mahmoud mentioned about the counter proposal. Can we have a counter proposal? Are we ready to have an alternate view on this mechanism? Is Egypt ready to respond and to adapt to this mechanism? How fast can we adapt?
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you so much for the introduction. Well, this is not my thing. I mean, how fast Egypt can adapt, it is up to the industry to say. And I think it's up to the relevant authorities to assess. Can we have a counter proposal? Again, as Dr. Mahmoud have mentioned, this is a policy put forward by the EU, and those of us who are exporting to the European Union in developing countries and developed countries need to work with the EU on seeing its implementability. One part of it is it shouldn't be taken as a climate measure, and this is something I be very clear on. This is a very clear trade measure. It has nothing to do with climate. and I will put this forward and explaining why we see that this measure tax is not in line with any of the agreements that are there. Of course, with all due respect, what the European Union has put forward and its compatibility and the aim and the target of this policy, but from our point of view as foreign affairs, we work with rules, agreements, and decisions, and within all of that, the CBAM does not fit as in line with the agreed principles or the agreed implemented decisions or the agreements in general. And it just adds a different or additional layer of burden on private sector and / countries in its implementation that it is not put forward in the Paris Agreement and the convention. I wouldn't go there, but I would just highlight that CBAM is very purely trade measure, focusing on trade competitiveness, leveling the playing field between private sector. And that's it. And even the revenues that come from the CBAM is not even directed to developing countries. It is directed to the EU and the EU countries and EU companies to assist them to be more environment friendly or more climate friendly. So in a way, we are subsidizing the EU companies to become greener. But I will stop there so I don't go in a red zone. But from my point of view, I mean, like measures and countermeasures to this is something is not. I'm not going to work on that. It's not my thing. Maybe Ambassador Omar will have something to add. But from my point of view, in the climate negotiations, this is very clearly not a climate-related measure, and it is in full breach of the convention, which says unilateral measures should not have an impact on trade. But I'll stop there. Thank you.
Now open the floor for Q&As. If anyone does have a question for Dr. Mahmoud or Mr. Vicente, please raise your hand. Mr. Vicente, would you like to have a comment on our concerns and our
Sure. Yep. If you allow me to react, that would be great. And thank you very much to Mr. Mohieldin for the presentation, the very detailed presentation, and also to the remarks made by Ambassador Nasr. Both of them said that this is not that this is not an environmental measure, that this is basically a trade measure. Even the ambassador was more adamant in saying that this is a competitiveness measure. I don't think there is no question that this is an environmental measure from the point of view that it takes into account it tackles greenhouse gases emissions of imported goods. It's not a customs duty, it's not a tax on the imports, which is completely disconnected or which does not take into account the environmental impact of the goods. And as I was explaining before, and I think that's something that we forget very often, the free allowances in the EU ETS for the EU producers will be gone, will completely phase out. As long as they are there, they will be also recognized to the importers or to the imported goods from third countries. And therefore, we see really the CBAM as a powerful tool in order to decarbonize the EU industry. And let's not forget another thing that you don't say. Now the EU industry is protected with respect to exports to third countries precisely because of the free allowances. And you mentioned WTO a lot. You know that the US in particular brought the EU to panels at the WTO against the free allowances, in particular for the steel sector, because they said that they were subsidizing the EU industry. Precisely because of the introduction of CBAM, we are getting rid of those free allowances. So you can see that also the EU industry has its concerns with the introduction of the CBAM, because once CBAM will be there, no free allowances will be there, the exports of the European Union will not be protected by the free allowances. And I don't want to elaborate more on that because I understand your concerns. That's something that we have tried to take into account in the design of the measure. The measure is difficult and not. That's why we target importers. the importers who know the ETS, EU ETS, are the ones who have to comply with the reporting under the CBAM obligations. But of course, it's clear that they need this information from you. The information is not difficult. As long as you monitor your emissions, it will not be difficult to share this information and to report this information. I mentioned before about the methodology. The methodology is being developed. For next year, your exporters will be able to monitor and report under the CBAM according to your own methodology, if you have your own methodology. And that will give time to adapt and to understand our methodology. So I don't really think that there is an important administrative burden with the introduction of the measure. It's just sharing this information. We don't protect the EU industry. I mentioned that before, and I want to highlight that again. It's not a competitiveness measure. To the contrary, as you can see from what I said, is not the case. We are not protecting. What we want is that everyone makes an effort to decarbonize. And I was happy to read the last slide from Mr. Mohieldin on the opportunities and on the decarbonization path, because this is exactly what we want to hear. And if you introduce also your carbon price, you will keep your revenues for yourself. We believe in multilateralism. President von der Leyen has been very clear on that from the beginning, has not changed about that. And we believe in the WTO. We are in contact with WTO Secretariat. We are in contact with members in the WTO. I mean, that's something that hopefully I think they are understanding. It may have an impact and an intended consequence on trade. I'm not going to say that, of course, any border measure has an impact on trade, but as you can see from the design, we don't stop the importation of any goods. It doesn't matter how intensive they are in carbon emissions. The goods will continue flowing without any additional requirement. It's only that importers, and I will reply to one of the questions in one of the slides, on the last slide, the importers will need to buy those certificates along the year, regardless of the moment when the goods are imported. You won't see any difference. The thing is that there is a need to report information at the end of the year, and there is an obligation on importers to buy the CBAM certificates. And they will benefit from the fluctuation of the price because they can buy at any moment, regardless of when the importation will take place, so that they take advantage of the fluctuation of the prices also in the EU ETS, and the price will be the same. So as you can see, we treat imported goods in the same way. We can say the opposite now. Now our goods are discriminated when sold in the European Union because they have to pay an EU ETS, while goods imported from their countries do not have to apply the same rules. You mentioned also LDCs and exemptions. I think someone said that you are not in favor of the exceptions. And that's what we try to avoid. We don't want to give exceptions. There was a lot of discussion also in the Parliament, in the European Parliament. Many members of the European Parliament were in favor of giving exemptions to the LDCs. But in the end, the conclusion was that this is not the good and the right signal, because we don't want to create graveyards of dirty technologies in Africa. That's what we don't want to do. We want you to attract, and we know that you have the assets. President Ruto said that in Nairobi last week. I was there with the president, and he was very clear. We have the opportunities and we have the availability to attract green technologies. You mentioned green hydrogen, you mentioned green electricity. Let's take the momentum. Morocco just signed a green partnership with the European Union. The EU, the industry in Morocco is very keen on applying that. They are very happy with that. Let's take this type of examples. You mentioned the JATPs. Let's go through them. Let's focus on them. Let's try to invest more on that. The European Union with the Global Gateway is one of the biggest donors in the world, if not the biggest donor in the world, for those investments. Let's take the opportunity. What we need is commitment from you that you want to decarbonize, that you want to attract green technologies, and you have the assets. You have the opportunities for renewable energy and renewable electricity in particular to produce green hydrogen, and you are able to attract these technologies. This will support your growth. This will just support your job creation. And we are completely confident in that. You are a great partner for us. You are our neighbors. We want to help you. What we need is that we go on the same direction. We need to make sure that all of us are aligned and we all understand that we need to go for green transition. Of course, we need the time for that. But that's the good thing with the CBAM. The CBAM will be introduced gradually from 2026, and then even from 2026, because of the free allowances, there will be a slow introduction. In particular, in the first 2 years until 2028, I think there was a question on the slide on this, and then from 2030, the reduction will be faster. I think that gives us time to talk, to understand each other, to see how we can help you, to help you more, and that's what the European Union really wants to do. And I think there are opportunities. It's not my responsibility. You know that there is another Directorate General, IMPA and NIR, who are responsible of the support to the countries. Let's continue working. You can count on us. I mean, I can tell you that we are pushing our colleagues to give more and more money for decarbonization, and in particular for the sectors which are covered by the CBAM. And the last point was on ACMEs, because that was mentioned by Mr. Mohieldin. There was a lot of discussion also about the ACME in Nairobi last week. We think that any carbon pricing, carbon markets have an important role to decarbonize, and also the voluntary carbon markets. What is important for us, and that's something where we need to work together, is that they are transparent. They are really they are good in quality when it comes to the projects that are financed, that there is no double dip, so that there is a real decarbonization and a real reduction of emissions. And let's discuss about them. I mean, we are open to listening to you. The president said that last week to President Ruto and to all of those who were present in Nairobi last week. And we really believe that any initiative to decarbonize, which really decarbonizes, is something that has to be taken into account, and we are positive about listening to you about this. I have to say that we know ETS, we know carbon taxes, we know how they work, we know how credible they are, and in particular, they are covered by the government. So there is a reassurance about the quality of the projects and about the objective of reducing emissions. But let's talk about other possibilities. And why not? Voluntary carbon markets. Carbon markets can bring financing money to Africa and Egypt in this case. And we really welcome any initiative, private initiative, that will, of course, help to finance decarbonization. But let's be credible about that. And I think that there is no way back. There is no alternative to this. If you show credibility, if you show that this is the path you want to go, we will be there, of course, to help you and to assist you with this transition. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vicente. I'll have a final comment, because this is the essence actually of LYNX Forum, that we share knowledge and share points of view on critical issues. So I'll ask Mr. Ambassador Omar Abou Eish, who is the Secretary General of the Permanent Secretariat for the Egypt-EU Association Agreement at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, to give a final comment, and then we'll open the floor for any question.
Thank you very much, Moataz. Since Dr. Mohieldin already said everything we had to say, however, I have a slight comment about what was said, the idea that saying CBAM is targeting only companies, not countries. I do agree with what Dr. Mohieldin said. A country is an umbrella of so many companies. However, in the case of Egypt, I would like to mention something very important, that the CBAM is in general targeting the most important source of energy in Egypt, which is natural gas. When targeting this natural resource, is targeting a country, because this sector receives about 60% of the foreign direct investments in Egypt. And its part is a major part of the East Mediterranean Gas Forum, where the EU is a member and is contributing positively in promoting the work of decarbonization of the natural gas. How would you treat our exports to the EU as a good? How would you apply the CBAM mechanism on our exports? of natural gas? And how would you treat some goods, for example, manufactured goods such as fertilizers, which rely to a big extent on the use of natural gas? This is one comment. Another one, we should take into consideration that Egypt is a major partner for the EU in the production of green hydrogen that will start maybe in a few years from now on. However, this green hydrogen is for the use of the European markets, not for the domestic use in Egypt. At least we should take into consideration the amount of gas produced in Egypt to be deducted from the CBAM mechanism that would be applied on our goods. That's why it's not only a concern of companies, it's a concern of a country. And the real hurted part would be the country, not only the companies. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ambassador. I will react quickly to your remarks, to your last remarks and questions. When we say that we target companies and not countries, is because we don't exempt countries per se based on any criteria, except for Norway, Iceland, Switzerland, because they apply the EU ETS or they are linked to our EU ETS. That's something very, very specific, but you can understand that. But for the rest, we don't say, okay, I don't know, the carbon intensity in this country is lower than the EU's carbon intensity or just a bit higher, and therefore the country is exempted. No, that's not the case. And then, as you know, in a country, even in Egypt, there might be two producers of the same good who produce with different technologies. For example, take the case of steel. There can be someone producing with electricity, with air arc, or there are people or there are companies producing with blast furnaces. Then the blast furnace production will be adjusted higher than the producer with an air arc or the one who is producing on the basis of a scrap steel. That's why we say that we are targeting companies and not countries. I understand your point that, of course, if you rely on a good a lot, or your exports rely a lot on a good, of course, that country may be impacted more than another country, but that's something different. It's because of the product that you are exporting. On your question on natural gas, we don't include natural gas in the CBAM scope. It's not one of the goods. Refinery goods, oil products are not included under the CBAM. Another thing is that if you use natural gas to produce steel, aluminium, or another product, and there are emissions which are linked to the use of the natural gas, of course, when you import the aluminium or the steel, the emissions which correspond to the burning of natural gas will have to be counted for the steel, but not for the importations of natural gas. So natural gas, not concerned with the application of CBAM at all. I forgot your last question, sorry. Maybe you remind me?
It was about
the green hydrogen, yes.
Yeah, green hydrogen, of course. We want to import more and more hydrogen, and in particular green hydrogen, and that's good news. That's why, of course, the emissions associated to the production of hydrogen will have to be taken into account. If you produce blue hydrogen, for example, or gray hydrogen, which is the worst, from the production from methane, or with or without absorption of the emissions, that of course will have to pay some sort of CBAM. If you produce hydrogen from renewables or renewable electricity, very green hydrogen, in that case, those imports will not be subject to an adjustment because there are no emissions associated. So by extending CBAM to the hydrogen, what we want to give is a strong signal and to promote the production of green hydrogen. And we understand that Egypt is in a very good situation to produce this because you have a lot of solar and you can rely also on other type of renewables, like could be hydropower and other type of sources. So that's something we really want to encourage. We really want to promote, because the EU will have a big deficit of hydrogen in the very soon. You possibly read our EU strategy on hydrogen, which was adopted only few months ago, and we count on Egypt as one of the important partners, because also the proximity will be easier in order to import more and more green hydrogen.
Thank you, Mr. Vicente, and I'd like to thank all speakers and for the wealth of information they have shared with us today that made us exceed the time. However, if anybody have a question. Please present yourself and
good morning. This is Mohamed, the Gas Regulatory Authority, the governmental body that represents the gas market in Egypt. Thank you so much for inviting me to this very important workshop. And my question is forward to Mr. Vicente. My question is regarding the hydrogen market escalation and scaling. I think the CBAM, in addition to the guarantee of origin schemes that will be put or as a matter of burden on the hydrogen production and whatever, do you think this kind of more additives of burdens will escalate the hydrogen market and the cooperation between Europe and the other countries, especially Egypt, as said by esteemed speakers here, that Egypt will be one of the potential exporters of hydrogen in different forms, but the green hydrogen on the top of that. So do you think CBAM, in addition to guarantee of origin schemes and other things, will be beneficial for scaling the hydrogen market among the European and the other countries, especially that Europe is targeting 10 million tons of hydrogen from outside the European Union, as you know that. So thank you very much.
Well, thanks a lot for this question. And again, I mean, I'm not responsible of the strategy on hydrogen, so I cannot tell you exactly what are the plans and how we intend to do that. But of course, my understanding is that we will need, of course, to scale up markets of hydrogen with third countries. And I understand that the neighboring countries will be the ones who will be benefiting more and more. Of course, the greener the hydrogen will be, the better for all of us, because also our responsibility and our aim is to encourage the production and importation of green hydrogen. So we believe that the introduction of CBAM and the application to the hydrogen, as I was saying before, will be an important incentive and encouragement in order to produce and also to import that type of hydrogen. Compared with the other hydrogen, I mean, if you will be importing green, then you will not pay CBAM, will be very low if there are any emissions. However, if you are importing gray hydrogen or blue hydrogen, in that case, you will need to pay some CBAM. So the encouragement, the motivation to produce more and more green will be higher, and therefore, for those countries who will produce in green hydrogen, it will be easier for them to attract investments, because multinationals will be more interested in focusing on that type of products and in those type of markets, and that will, of course, ensure the possibility of scaling up the importation, the production of hydrogen. But you will need to talk to someone who is responsible for hydrogen policy in the European Union in order to go more into the details. But CBAM can, of course, contribute to this direction.
Thank you, Mr. Vicente.
Hello. Actually, I have a questions and a comment. First, let me introduce myself. My name is Yasser El-Ghazi from MOPCO. MOPCO is the company that produce ammonia and urea. And my direct question is, I want to know how I will get the information about the benchmark. For example, let's say ammonia production have a GHG, green hydrogen emission of which number? How I will get the benchmark of the Europe that I have to to get, as you just know, if we need to just reduce our carbon emission, it will take a lot of modifications and it will be a costly process. So normally we need to understand the numbers or the figures now and the estimation of the figures in 2026. So the process will take more than 2 to 3 years to implement any changes in such mega plans. The second comment, which I know that it will not change anything about the regulation, but I have to be clear about that from your conversation. When you just mentioned that you excluding natural gas and refined products, I believe that you excluded because it will have a direct impact on the inflation of your people. So you have also to think about the counter part. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. About the benchmarks for ammonia and urea, I mean, we mirror completely how the European ETS is working. The benchmarks are set by the colleagues in DG Klima for those products, and they are set for every year. Those benchmarks are being reduced over time in order to put pressure on the decarbonization. So I'm not sure if the benchmarks for 26 are already known. I think that they are known until 2030. But I mean, that's something I would need, of course, to check with them. Our intention is that from 2026, we will publish the benchmarks that will be used for the CBAM, and every year or before the start of every year, so the producers in the countries can understand what are the benchmarks that have to be used. If you are interested in knowing what are the benchmarks now for urea and for ammonia under the ETS, what I propose is that you write to me. Someone can give you my email address, and then I will redirect you to the colleagues who are responsible and can give you the information. I understand the information is on the website, but maybe not so easy to find. But of course, we can put you in contact with the person who is responsible of the benchmarks.
Actually, I mean the estimation, and I mean it because if I'm going to, for example, make a carbon capture.
Sorry for interruption. Let's keep this very technical.
No. I just it's very important for us. Just a second.
Yes, we will put you in contact with the technical people in the department.
I understood, but I'm not talking about today's figures. I'm talking about the estimate figures. It will take investment for 2 to 3 years. So, for example, if you give me today figures and I'm going to invest, I will not reach 2026.
This session. So
no, sorry, just to clarify, as I was saying before, I'm not the expert in this, but I understand that the benchmarks for the moment are more or less stable and known until 2030, not beyond that, but I think that will give you already an indication. So the best is to get in touch and you can discuss directly with the person responsible of those benchmarks.
Okay, thank you for giving the opportunity for this interesting session. I'm Rami Saleh, Chief Business Development and Sustainability Officer at Al-Maragbi Steel here in Egypt. We are a steel making company, scrap-based, as Vicente was mentioning about those who are lucky to have a scrap-based route. My request for Vicente is we need you guys in the European Union, if this thing is going to happen, and it seems it will be happening, just to make very, clear instruction and the issue with the websites and all. You cannot leave us for, as Mr. Mohieldin was saying, for lawyers and for, consultants and whoever, because when you are keeping silent and when you are saying that, okay, there is a 2-year interval for adaptation or whatever for reporting, 2 years is not a long period. 2 years for me is like tomorrow and the day after. So, and please allow me to comment like that. You said that your website will be okay on October, but maybe in January or maybe in whenever, Yeah, I mean, these kind of issues for us leave us confused. We are not having a very clear cut what we are going to do. That there are too many methodologies for reporting, like the GRI or the SBT or whatever, or EcoVadis, or there are too many. And also there are too many certificates for the products, like the environmental product declaration, like responsible steel for steel specific. Maybe there is something else for aluminum, another third for fertilizer or whatever. So we are really, honestly, got lost to this stuff. We need to be very clear on that issues. This is one request. The other request also, I quote again Mr. Mohieldin about that we don't need that much investment on training, awareness, whatever. I think all of us now are fully aware of that. We just maybe needing another kind of investment and support from European Union. Maybe from a country perspective, it should be something big. But for us in the industry, it might be something not that expensive, not that big investment. Like you help us to, for example, to measure our carbon emission. You help us to have, to set up the control instruments or whatever. So this kind of investments are not that big, but whenever we are asking for it, we don't reach any, conclusion. We just have the investment on training, awareness, etc. Thank you.
No, thanks a lot for your point. As I mentioned before, and you can see on my last slide, there is a link to our website. In the website, you will already find the guidance how to measure for every specific good, including for steel. And for steel, you will see that, for example, there are 6 different process routes. I mentioned e-arc, I mentioned blast furnaces. I mean, there are like 6 different production routes, and there you will find all the information. I also mentioned that we are launching e-learning. So the modules will be very soon online. And then we are also having specific webinars per sectors. The first webinar will be this week on the 15th on the cement. I don't remember now the dates, exactly the dates for all the webinars, but if you go to our website, you will find the dates, the specific dates, and the possibility how to register in order to follow the webinar. In any case, the webinars will be recorded after, and they will be on our website so that they can be consulted at any time. And of course, we are happy for taking any questions that you may need to resolve and send them to us. On technical capacity, I mean, I understand it's my colleagues in DG Klima and not us who are in contact with the different governments, ministries of environment in many countries, where they, of course, provide technical support in order to help to introduce carbon pricing or to measure emissions, etc., etc. I think that the best way is to go through your Ministry of Environment to check how this could be channeled, in particular for the specific needs of the Egyptian industry for the application of CBAM. What we can do again is those webinars, the guidance, and of course publications and learning modules on how to apply CBAM. And again, I mean, the obligations will be on the importers, so also rely on your importer in the European Union in order to help you to go through this process. But start with reading the guidance. You will find that this is very detailed, it's very technical, very specific for every production route, for every product, and also register to the webinar, because I think it will be very useful for you to understand, at least on overall terms, to understand what CBAM is, how it applies to your sector, and what are you supposed to monitor and report during the transitional period.
Thank you, Vicente, for this, and we will share all the information related in the presentation and the link you provided, and we encourage all of participants to have a look on this, because actually your ability to comprehend and collect as much information as you could will help you to deal with this mechanism effectively. So we'll have here a last comment on, please.
Hello, and thank you for the very insightful morning and presentation. I'm Ghada Hamouda, Group Chief Sustainability Officer for an investment holding company in Egypt and East Africa. Integrated Energy, we are in cement services and consultation, not manufacturing. We are also in many other sectors, agri-foods. And while we do not directly get affected today by CBAM, I mean, we are looking into its impact on future. We're exporting food products and other things. So I'm here to listen. And I have to say, I was also last week in Kenya, and I listened to President Ruto and all the other presidents and their ambitions to move from aid to trade. And if in fact we are to move from aid to trade, we need a better environment. I speak for the private sector. There is a squeeze on the private sector. I mean, as we are absolutely collectively trying to manage the risks involved in trying to decarbonize and trying to be part of the solution for greener solutions. I mean, Khala Holdings, my company, has just signed a protocol with one of your French company, Accents, to produce sustainable aviation fuel eventually out of agri-residue in Egypt that will be exported. We are really trying to jump and be part of solutions, green solutions. However, I think CBAM, while it is very well-intentioned effort to encourage decarbonization outside the borders and create the necessary political space, which I totally understand, to adopt stricter carbon targets within them, it does introduce enormous complexities. And I think it is very important that we are cognizant, and I'm echoing what we heard today, it does not exacerbate the global trade tensions or undermine the fragile foundations for our world trading system. I look very carefully at the impact about equalizing the playing field, as you say, and if anything, I believe it unlevels the playing field as opposed to creating that equity and the transition to a low carbon economy. We have to look very carefully at what we need to do as private sectors across the African continent and different countries in emerging markets to reskill our people working in industries deemed carbon intensive, standard fossil fuel assets that we need to start to see how we're going to manage. These challenges must all be addressed, and so that this is seen as part of maintaining a global trading system as opposed to deglobalizing or squeezing out the impact or involvement or engagement or contribution of private sectors across borders. And as just to echo one of the points made here, I mean, clearly, as I sit in a boardroom talking to my shareholders or my board, clearly one of the things we look at is where should we go and the cost of the transition. And clearly, we're trying to replicate success stories. I mean, we're in energy transmission, and we're trying to look into African countries and the opportunities there. I would love to see that there is a framework that's created that does respect the Paris Agreement and is compliant with it, WTO rules, that makes it possible for the African private sector and the Egyptian private sector to contribute, as I said, as opposed to feeling more pressures. I cannot even begin to tell you, we have 40 companies and more, and these 6 sectors, to try to do benchmarking and reporting just for the basic SBTI and all the other things required. Now to get into the CBAM reporting and try to do it sector by sector is putting a lot of pressure. And again, I just want this to be an equal and level playing field as opposed to an equal one.
Thank you. This is clear. Thank you very much. We have a final question from Mr. Ahmed Kamal, the Executive Director of the Climate Compliance in the Egyptian Federation Industry.
Thank you. Okay, I was not clear. It's not a question. It's just a comment, but it has to be clear. I'm representing Federation of Egyptian Industry, representing 110,000 companies in Egypt under the Federation, over 19 industrial chambers. So we have metallurgy, chemical, food, textile, and all industry chambers under Federation of Egyptian Industry. It has to be clear because I heard some of the companies mentioning opposite, but it has to be clear that we need a huge capacity building, technology transfer for our industry. We are not ready. No one said our industry is ready for that. It's so clear that some of the companies did efforts, but we have the majority still. There are a gap to comply with CBAM, and this will affect our exports to Europe. So Europe has to understand that you're importing from our companies will be affected if we don't have capacity building, finance support to our companies. So we have to look for programs for supporting. It has to come from EU or others, but our companies, I'm talking about the majority, needs finance to comply with CBAM. Otherwise, our exports to Europe will be affected. I'm not saying dramatically, but it will be affected. So knowledge, capacity building, finance. It's the items we need for our industry to comply with CBAM. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Message is very clear. We just have a final comment from Dr. Mahmoud, and then we'll have a short 15-minute break before going to the second session.
Right. Thank you so much. I think this is a very useful share of knowledge. I think many of us, including me, coming out from the session, learning more about what we should be expecting. But there are a few things that I hope will not really trigger another round of reactions, given the time. But the first one, when I said, and I believe in that I don't believe in exceptions and exemptions, because in a way, we are a proof that the main rule that we're trying to exempt people from or companies from may have a lot to be desired in terms of its efficiency and fairness from the very beginning. And that, without really getting too much into how the European policy is being designed, it's like here in Egypt, when we had some stage unreasonable tax policies, without fixing the rule, we said, well, we're going to be exempting almost everybody at the end, and then we started to reconsider that this is going to be harmful to the budget. The design of the policy, the laws, the way and the proceeds are in need for more efficient mechanism, and this is basically more important than the exceptions and the exemptions and the compensation as a rule as well. Compensation is there only for the losers, and normally the loser does not get fully compensated. This is another rule of the game when it comes to trading. So I'm blunt to that, and in other methods as well. On the issue, as one of the speakers mentioned, Mr. Root and others were there. I was happy to see the good in the developments in Africa, especially with the sophistication of the business people and the civil society. I hope that our institutions and policy frameworks in our continent is as sophisticated as the market participants. That needs to change, because what we're encountering here is not a competition corporate to corporate, because we see the fitness in that, but it's basically, it's an institution called the EU in cooperation with the member states, having a policy that will have an impact on others. They are not designed from a kind of charitable consideration, but what would be impact on the poor, what would be impact on a remote village that we don't know. This is the concern of us, not them. The EU is designing policy as it should for the benefit of the Europeans within the rules of engagement of the system. I'm amazed at this kind of great charitable consideration for how the US or the EU or China or Korea or Vietnam designing their policies. They design their policies for the benefit of the people. It's like you train your football team in a good day to win. You do the best in institutional policy and training for them to win based on the rule of FIFA. Don't expect that the German or the Italian team is going to be compromising the rule to give you a chance to score for everybody to be happy. This is not the rule of the game. And it's obvious, it's common sense what's missing in the discussion. The other thing, we mentioned unintended consequences, but now they are known. We have been revealing them. It's basically for us to cost them out and then to put them in the overall partnership agreement and check the other measures. Innocent bystanders, yes, there will be many of them. And actually for companies, they could be right, but I'm not quite sure that any company with this scale and magnitude of the CBAM is going to be saved from direct or indirect relations. Check your supply chain, check who's your supplier, who's your beneficiaries, and don't just check your balance sheet of yesterday. This is a dynamic issue that we need to consider. Then, yes, Mr. Ruto said something nice, aspirational. I remember back in 1997 when I had a discussion with one of the most competent ministers that this country had seen in economy and trade. And the notion is from aid to trade came with the US and Europe at the time. I was joking and I was right. It's basically from aid to no aid. Trade is a fight. You can decide, as it happened with the USAID, for instance. Because of the Camp David agreement, we had some portion of funds. This had been gradually declining. This is reality. This is fact. To increase your trade with the US or with Europe, this is a fight of competition and efficiency that you need to work on. Not coming out of charitable consideration or because the European occupied our neighborhood for quite some time or the US is good for us. This is not how it works. And if it works with this kind of moral kind of stance, it will not work with China because they didn't occupy us, and or the Vietnamese, they were like us or worse economically a few years ago. The final thing here, again, congratulations for my friends in the EU and the US. They designed good policies for their own people. As a trade believer and economic liberal, as it should be for many, but I'm not really pushing that into others. I wish it was more outward looking, more in partnership. IRA had been accepted democratically across the aisle, as they say in the US, for the good of the Americans. The EU policies on climate action and Green Shield, it could be an answer to that and more because they were faster than this. What we need here in the Egypt of the world and on the Ghana and Kenya is to have our policies, not just as a response, but basically as forward-leaning kind of policy that needs not just to have counter proposals, but we need to go into that old judo strategy. We are smaller than the economies of Europe and the US and definitely China, but we are smaller. That gets us into the judo strategy of being fast, efficient, and nimble. If you are losing that advantage of being smaller to be fast and nimble and can accommodate changes, you will be losing again. And we'll be just attending endless courses on how to deal with the new arrangements of that world order that we are seeing unfolding, and a new one is coming. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Mahmoud. Thank you, Ambassador Nasr and Ambassador Eish. And thank you, Mr. Vicente, for having time with us for this dialogue, and we'll keep the dialogue open with our partner. Thank you so much. We'll have a break for 15 minutes and convene for the second session. Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation again, and bye-bye.